Beautiful. Cool. All right. So let's talk comms. So Nina, you had the original question of how to communicate to the teams, right? Tell me the problem that I guess that you were wanting to actually solve through this as well.
So super quick. I know it looks in text, it looks like Nina. It's actually Nina.
Nina. Oh my gosh.
Worries.
Thank you.
No worries.
Yes.
No worries. It happens all the time. So no worries at all. But so again, I just joined Bizarre Voice, coming up on 6, building out, onboarding, doing amazing things with our existing programs. But I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of that messaging getting out to our learners.
Yeah.
And so, even like we're struggling a little bit with adoption. Like when I came in, no one was even tracking like if people showed up for training, which I was like, okay, well, that's gonna like we're starting to track now. And every other week I'm presenting our data to our executive team. But I'm trying to think like how do we, because we do a evaluation to our mostly to our sales leaders. I support both sales and CS, but
okay,
mostly to our sales leaders about kind of here's what's coming.
Yeah.
Here's the metrics on the most recent trainings, which are still not where they need to be. And then just trying to help our managers be more effective managers, because I think there's a bit of a shift in culture that needs to happen.
Okay.
That I was hoping that it would sort of cascade out to their teams, but I don't think that's actually the case. So I have tried email newsletters in past companies and I hate them. Like they take a lot of work,
right?
And nobody reads them.
Absolutely.
And then everybody tries to like jam their stuff in because they're like, oh, you're sales enablement, so like you can tell them all about my stuff too.
Yeah.
And it becomes a lot of work for, I don't think the ROI is there. So I was just thinking like with a sales audience, my thought process was, at least the way I would much rather watch like a 3 or 5 minute video than to go like read a super long email with like a gazillion links in it. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if we can give them that quick little like under 5 minute video that just gives them the highlights. In fact, I was thinking of calling it like the enablement high five.
That's awesome.
And then just give them the snippets and then follow up with like, if you want more, like, here's where you go find all the stuff, right? Yeah. So that you have to like read something to go dig in and find what it is. I don't know. That's just my initial thought, but I didn't know if anybody had tried it, if it worked.
Yeah.
I've got a guy on my team who's like super engaging, super funny. And I was like, you're doing the video because people will watch it because he's funny and he can like bring it to life.
I love that. Yeah. So
yes.
My experience at Huddle, I was in charge of the newsletter and I honestly like threw it out the window after 3 months of doing it. I even like was tracking it with like HubSpot just to make sure like I had metrics. And honestly, my open rate was probably like 10%. And I think the 10% was me. So I was like, hell no, I'm not wasting my time. I don't care if you guys don't want the information, I'll post it somewhere else. So I really have focused on this at 2 orgs now of really distributing the information properly. And so I'm going to create this as a template for everyone to use as well too. So you guys will have this, but this is kind of what I've built as far as like our go-to-market comms and training portfolio. I wanted to find a way for me to deliver the information, but at least have that consistency and follow up from the managers. So this right here is the weekly calendar that I actually had out for all of our managers to change. So team stand-ups were a mandatory that's already happening, so we don't have to worry about that. But then we had an org blockers where we had marketing, product, and enablement in there to go ahead and basically break down anything that's happening. But the bigger part, Nina, that you were looking for was more of how do I communicate that information, especially with cross-functional departments that are always trying to throw a bunch of information in. I always hosted an hourly biweekly. Each topic had no more than 3 minutes at a piece that they could be able to speak to. And I made that restriction because if there was more to it, it was overcomplicated and they're not going to pay attention to it. So that was my thing. You had 3 minutes to share what you needed to share, and you had to have a resource doc in order for them to follow through with that. So once we went ahead and did that bi-weekly here, you could see that the next one was the product deep dive. So if I launched like a new product or a new process, the following week during that same time, I was able to go ahead and do the practices or do more of a deep dive or more of how the user would actually experience that and allow our reps to really get that full depth knowledge of actually what we talked about the week prior. So that brings me into this section here. This looks crazy. I apologize, but this was our like very meticulous way of how we're actually going to be showcasing information. So this is highlighted right here. This was actually that schedule that we were looking on. And this is exactly where we were talking about as far as the go to market biweekly. We had that, the lesson lead was assigned and we shared all the assets. And then the Tuesday before the product deep dive, that's when the lesson was actually due. And so that right there was more of like that reinforcement. It was a short turnaround, but you can also see that Thursday, right after the biweekly, was the team huddle. And then the Monday before the lesson was due was the team huddle to reiterate that those are also due. So we actually had a higher completion of our trainings, as well as those questions prepared for the product deep dive.
And you say team huddle, are you saying the whole team that you support as learners, or is it like the manager team huddles, or what do you mean?
Yeah, so that was actually just the so each manager had their team huddles with their own team. So it wasn't even I was part of those. That was the management team that was working with their sales reps. And with that, that was the only way that I knew, hey, managers, this is your playbook for this launch. You need to follow this and make sure that your deadline is done by this day. And after I instilled that culture of like, these go out on a Wednesday, they are due on a Tuesday, that manager knew exactly, hey, I need to pull this report, or I would send out a report on Monday saying these are all what's left. And then all of those managers would be able to follow through with that as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you creating?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. And like for those lesson lead assignments, like, are you creating videos? Like how in depth, what kind of commitment were you asking for to do in between that like Thursday and Wednesday block?
Yeah. So with that, I usually made sure that the lesson was no longer than 45 minutes. And that was the one thing that I was very cautious about. And so I made a mixture of video. I made a mixture of, trial and error, make a pitch or do something with that. Because the one thing that, especially in this remote world that we're having to really focus on is all of these different types of learners are learning different ways. And if I only throw a video at you, our tactical learner is never going to be able to do this. Or if I do it with the tactical side, our video or visual learner is never going to comprehend exactly what's going on either. And so that's why I do a mix of everything. Those elements were probably more geared towards that.
Oh.
Yeah, that makes sense. We do something similar to your biweekly like deep dive where it's a 30-minute meeting and you have no more than like one slide. Everybody gets a slide who's presenting. So it tends to be like 2 or 3 minutes. But I think where we're missing is the follow through piece. It's like you get all this information and it's like, here's a launch that's happening, whether it's big or small. We'll always remind you, even if it's big and we're doing other training, but then we don't have the like follow through. And I think the consistency is maybe where we're missing too. The expectation of like, you get this on Thursday and it's due on Wednesday. And like, you can expect that because you can't even like, it's the communication of like telling people that they have a training. It's like, of course you get the email from the LMS. Of course you like, we remind you in Slack, but it's like, there's so much stuff in Slack that I just know they're not that we put out there.
I actually had sellers tell me like, oh, I don't really pay attention to Slack. I was like,
I have had that too.
So that's really intriguing, right? And like, this is why this is not a one size fits all, because I would say every company that I've been at, our reps don't go anywhere but Slack. And so that's like that's the funny part, right? Like we have people that are so ingrained in it and so not. So that's exactly what we also made sure that we outlined in this as well too. So you can see here how Guru or our CMS is highlighted. This is the source of truth for all go-to-market internal teams. And what we would do is anytime that we would have any of this information go out, this would actually go shared through the Lunchbox learning that we did. This would go out in an email, and it would also go out in a Slack. So that way they had everything, but we only shared where the original information was housed from. So it's never a copy and paste, because then they could go back into the CMS or, Guru or HighSpot. They were able to go ahead and either bookmark that page or add it to their collections as well. And so that way you would still be able to trigger who is actually responding to the certain information or blogs that you guys are actually putting out.
No, that makes sense. I think I was, even with my bi-weekly email to the leaders, because that's when I got that feedback. Oh, well, I don't really pay attention to Slack. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to keep posting it in Slack. Yeah. And then I'm going to send you an email with a link to the Slack.
Yeah. So the one thing that I always say with Slack, there's always all these different methods of communication, and Slack, in my opinion, as much as I am a Slack heavy user, I will always say Slack. It is one of the worst ways to communicate, I feel, as an enabler, because it gets so buried so quickly with other different things. Like when I was posting stuff about, hey, your trainings are due, the next person 2 seconds later would go ahead and post, hey, I need help with X. And it's like, okay, well, you just bombarded my entire message. And when I do all here, you're not even going to see my message now. You're just going to see the one that's right there. And so if it's like, I always had like a priority matrix for communication as well at Huddle, where I was able to say, okay, if it was like a tier 1 conversation, which was like, doesn't matter, quick minor fix, whatever, yeah, I'd Slack that out. If it was more of something that I needed to be able to retain and remember or hold as a reference, that was a tier 2, and I would go out in an email and a Slack. And then if it was even bigger at a tier 3, like we really needed to sit down, discuss this, and really go through, like that's where we brought it into the biweekly and all hands.
Yeah. This is great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's something to like the consistency. That's another thing that I implemented when I started at Bizarre Voice, was like training was just sort of whenever, like, oh, we need to do this thing and we're going to schedule it on X date. And so now we at least have, like, we have training Tuesday. And so it's always at the same time every Tuesday. They have a block. And even if that day isn't, because each training has maybe a slightly varied audience, depending on the topic. So we have a placeholder that says, like, even if you don't get like an actual session that you're supposed to attend, like use this 75 minutes to like do your e-learnings, because our completion rates are abysmal.
I like that idea, because we've like strayed away from holding specific times, because it's like, well, I don't want to take up time just to fill time, and I want to make sure that what we're doing is valuable. And I'm at a startup, it's like 220 people, and our like go-to-market audience is like 100, and there's 2 of us. So I'm like, if we don't have anything that's totally worthwhile, the team needs to focus on other stuff. And so I like that, though, in terms of like, even if we aren't running something live with you, you 100% have e-learning that you haven't completed yet, or like you can use this time to like refresh yourself on something, or like still utilize this time for enablement.
One of the things that I will call out, and I noticed this with my last company, was we had that same mentality. We had Tuesdays where we would do an enablement session, and Thursdays where it was your self-learn, right? Like get your learnings done, do gong calls, do whatever you had to do from an enablement hour. We called it that enablement hour block. And with that time, we actually noticed, one, our completion rates were not increasing. We had no people doing gong calls during that time. We had reps that are signed offline saying that they're doing enablement activities, and nobody was doing anything. So we actually saw a negative response to that. And so we nipped that in the butt, right? Like that's why I've developed the schedule of like, hey, your trainings will always go out on a Wednesday, and they're always due that following Tuesday. Like regardless, like if it's out, it's done by that day. No ifs, ands, or buts. And we actually did percentage completions too. So if they did not complete that lessonly by that Tuesday, they're automatically docked 25 points. And I would always score them. If it was complete on the day or of that day, I would give them 100%. And then I would dock them another 25 and another 25 by a certain metrics. And so we kept that in there. And then if they failed to a certain mark on trainings, our SVP was very much, if they're not doing it, we're pipping them. Like, we're going to put them on a pip because that's their expectations. So we did that, but we also hosted enablement office hours, which was more of an open communication dialogue. And we actually had stronger responses from that than the open call block hour or the open enablement hour.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if you're going to do that, make sure that you like start your benchmarks and understand like what start before, and then what am I seeing as that increase? And if it works for you, all the more power to you. Like, that's fantastic. But I just want to make sure like you call that out, like as though it's a solution. Sometimes it doesn't really benefit.
We're actually doing it because it's funny because we had the training, we'd implemented the training Tuesday, like shortly after I came on board. And then I actually, my SVP or Chief Revenue Officer said, you know, well, can we put something on the calendar to remind them to do their e-learnings? Because our live attendance is actually pretty good. Like,
right.
I mean, it's not,
ours is too, yeah.
It's not where it needs to be, but it's like, it's almost 70%. So I'm okay with it. It's our e-learnings that are just awful, like awful. Yeah. And so he's like, well, I want you to put like a calendar reminder on every Friday to remind people to like do their e-learning. So we've tried that. Or not, we'll see. That was just been a couple weeks now. Because he was like, well, I live and die by my calendar. And I was like, okay, like I get that. I was like, but we do, I don't know. It was like, for the month of March, we did March Madness, where I actually was like gamifying it. Like, people got points for like if they participated, if they completed their e-learnings on time, etc., which definitely helped. But I was like, even still, like I was sending out reminders, like, you haven't done your e-learning, like you want to earn your points. I was like, yeah. And finally, it's like, I'm like, I can't sustain like sending out 5 reminders for every e-learning just to make sure that they're doing them. Like, one of my saying, great, do you do that? I was like, no, the LMS sends you a reminder. Like, why does it have to come from me personally for you to actually take action on it?
Yeah.
And I think that was the big thing too. Like, what LMS are you guys actually using?
We use MindTickle.
MindTickle. Do they have a Slack integration by chance? So Lessonly and Workram both have those. And I've actually utilized that more. Is I actually, during my onboarding, and I actually made sure everybody did this in completion, that they attach that app into Slack, because then it will actually notify them via Slack saying, hey, you have an assignment that's now triggered, and hey, your assignment is now due within a day or due on this date soon. And so it sends those prompted reminders. Also, anytime that I do always release that, I always send the automatic information straight to them as well too. So the automatic reminders that come with those, to have those complete. So I would, if that's the case, if your team is really looking to only respond to you, I always recommend doing a refresh for like a biweekly and saying, hey, this is the enablement charter that is happening. This is how enablement will now communicate to you. If you have a training, they are set on these dates, due by here. This is the expectations here. You will get a reminder to complete your dates from this email address, not from me, but from this email address. And you will only get one. And if it's not done, these are the consequences. And I think I would share that. I would talk to your SVPs or CROs and see like, hey, like, what is the enablement training perspective that you want to have? If they don't complete, what happens? Yeah. And that's a conversation too, just to even have that strict conversation with, to really develop and see where exactly your SVP or CRO is actually aligned with as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We're missing out on the consequences a little bit. Like it's like, we got it stood up. Like we're trying to figure out what works for us well, but like, oh, there's so much, everything's so busy all the time. Like, we want to make money. Like we're like totally lacking, I think, in the like what does it mean if you don't do it?
Right.
Like what does that accumulate to over time? And like, how do we handle those things?
So
yeah, and I will say that our CRO has not to our learners, but he has said to his leaders that this is potentially a pivot situation. Right. Like if people are habitually not doing their training, like there's no excuse. I mean, we set a budget for training, like a time budget.
Yep.
Like every learner will have between 4 and 6 hours of learning per month.
Yeah.
So it's 90 minutes a week. Like it's not, and most people actually don't even get that much. Like that's just what we can do.
Right.
A lot of times it's less than that. And I was like, guys, like this is not, I'm not asking for half of your work week.
Right. Right.
90 minutes.
Yeah. And that's the best part, right? Like I love that you guys have a budget set for that. When I was at Chorus, my CRO gave me a budget too. And it was the first time I've ever heard of that. And I'm like, thank you, actually, like, because now I know if I've done too much or I've done too little. And Carly, your part, right? Like, oh, there's just so much. There's all of this. This is exactly where we actually put this blackout date in play.
Yeah.
So that way I was never going to say, hey, on the 26th, you have this due. Nope, I'll actually move that due date to the 5th. Because it's end of month, or hey, the last 10 days of the quarter, I'm not going to assign you anything. And I think that holistically showing this to my sales reps, they were more inclined to receive my training because they knew that I was taking their time into consideration as well. So it's being respectful of that both sides, right? Like, hey guys, I'm not going to do anything for you here because you need to focus that. But I do ask these other days that are not blacked out, that this is where your education comes into play. And so I really think, Nina, like explaining your budget and explaining blackout dates and how the communication of the trainings are actually going to happen, I think will bring a bunch of like new, fresh eyes of how enablement works with you. And I think that's the big thing when new leaders come in too, or new, enablement people. We come in here with these grand ideas and what has worked at our previous companies or what has worked with our peers. And we do that, but we don't explain that to the people that are receiving it, right? Like we're still in sales. We're selling our ideas, our vision, our practices to the sales team. They're our audience. And nobody likes feature selling. I can feature dump you all the time, but it's how the value is going to impact you. And that's exactly where enablement pulls in that bigger aspect there.
Yeah. I really like the fact that you mentioned like communicating that budget to the end learners, because we do. I mean, we black out the last 2 weeks of every quarter. Yeah. We do all of those things, but they probably don't recognize that. All I know is they got a backlog of e-learning sitting in MindTickle that's waiting for them to do it, right?
And
have you ever done a cleanup of like, I like part of me was wondering like, should we like go back? Oh, yeah, God, there's got to be trainings on there that are a couple months old, like don't go back and do that one. Like
I had because we got that feedback, like there's just so like when I log in there's so much I don't know what I'm supposed to do.
Yep.
And so we cleaned up everything that had been assigned before the start of like whenever we did it, like anything like 90 days prior. If it had been assigned more than 90 days prior, we just wiped it out. We're like, if they haven't done it by this point, they're not going to do it.
And that's exactly what I was just going to say is we actually implemented clean slate, right? Like I didn't care where you're at. I erased all training paths for everybody. And that honestly was a breath of fresh air for a lot of our sales team. And I said, listen, I'm only doing this because this is what it's going to look like now. And that was like the trade-off, right? Like the give and take as we're negotiating with our teams, right? Like, hey, I'm going to do this for you if you can continue to do this for me. If you don't do this for me, this is what I have to do then. And so it was that perfect trifecta of all of us understanding exactly what education and enablement actually meant to them.
Yeah.
And I think the big thing too is
that's
like
helpful.
enablement can come in and we have such strong ideas and personalities too. A lot of us come from either sales or marketing backgrounds where we have had to have a loud voice, and we can still carry that through to our sales team who have loud voices and strong personalities. And I think that's the hard part is how do we also figure out how do we communicate to them to understand this aspect. And I think a lot of this as well too is actually pulling your sales team to help be your training champion or your liaison for that train the trainer mentality. And then they are the ones that are help pushing the issue with you. And then you have that frontline assistance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think part of it is that I'm battling a little bit of heartburn from the previous enablement leader that just pushed out stuff everybody got everything. So it's like totally like just peanut butter. And so like people are still like, well, I don't know if this is really for me. And so like I had to say, like, if you are getting assigned to training, it's because your leader has told us that you should get this. Like, and so like even just that sort of battling that uphill or that previous heartburn has been a challenge. Yeah.
One thing that we did to kind of like make sure that we had everything outlined. So this was for our certifications, but you could definitely do this for your education models too. So we actually had every department that's in here. And so if you do sales roles, right? Like partnerships, business development, account executives, solutions engineering, you get this level of training no matter what. Like everybody has to do this. But more specifically, what do you get here? Or what do you get on the advanced side? And we would make these outline overviews here. Like this is the general overview of the product, ICPs, demos, collateral resources. And then the second session would be same thing. You would get the first tier, but then how to demo effectively, how to curate specific messaging towards the product and overcoming objections, right? Like your BDR team probably doesn't need to do much of the demo side of this, but they might have to do some of the overcoming objections, right? Everybody that's on the sales side will have to do that. And so understanding like what and how you're structuring your trainings and what goes into each one of those can very well help build out who gets what and where. And that could reduce that peanut butter effect as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
and we need a little refresh on that too. We're doing a little onboarding right now is like everybody gets everything and then you have your role specific stuff. But now I think we're getting to the point where it just needs to be a little bit more like 101, 201.
So one of the things that we did, I called it the highway effect when we went down on our onboarding is I highlighted a highway section where during that hour, I would have a BDR specific or an AE specific or a sales manager, solutions engineer specific course that would go during that time. And we had peers that were teaching that specifically towards them. And then they would come back and regroup as almost a product or like a whole consensus type thing. And then that way that actually reduced my 201 onboarding for an additional week and have them scattered out. But it was more aligned of having that product or that role specific training during that moment. Right.
But that's really interesting. I like that.
Yeah. So like instead of creative writing,
you would be using like breakout rooms, like so everybody would come together and then you would separate them out by role, or what do you mean?
So essentially, yeah. So let's say like we have class at 12, right? Which this is holistically like our marketing overview. Everybody's going to get that. But then at 1 o'clock, I'm doing more of a role specific training. So I would have a meeting for our BDRs, a separate meeting for our AEs, a separate meeting for engineers, and a separate meeting for managers. They would all go to their prospective meetings. Their peers would actually be leading those meetings. And then at 2 o'clock, they would actually leave those meetings and come back to go to a product specific meeting or a generic role meeting that they would have to go to. So that way, instead of having that second or third week of onboarding and the specifics of their role, that they're now learning specifically their role along with everything else instead of learning the basics and then expanding on their own.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Cool.
So yeah, hopefully this has helped.
Yeah, really helpful.
I'm definitely willing to share any, I'll build out this as a template for you guys or for everybody to have, and that way we can go there. And then if you guys need help or want to run anything past, like feel free just to ping me or let me look. Everything is strictly confidential. I'm not going to share anything across companies, but definitely want to be here as a resource for you guys as well.
Yeah, it's always a helpful reminder that
you
could do enablement at one company and what worked perfectly for you there does not work perfectly for you.
Exactly.
It's not just like, okay, I'm going to do exactly what I did here over here. So it's always like a little bit of a refresh every time.
The glass slipper never fits twice is what I So that is, I always have brought that to everybody. So
That's so good. So
Yeah.
good. Really appreciate it.
of course, again, let me know if you guys have any
This
questions.
was super helpful. Yeah,
Good.
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good luck, and let me
Awesome.
know if there's
Thanks.
anything else.
Hey,
Awesome.
take care.
Bye.
Bye.